Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard when Marcel Dubois stepped out of his cabin to find 10 massive Apache women standing in a perfect circle around his home. Each warrior stood nearly 6 feet tall, their powerful frames draped in traditional Apache garments, adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the early light like captured fire. Their faces were painted with white clay and crimson ochre in patterns that spoke of war and judgment, and their dark eyes held the cold intensity of predators who had found their prey. Marcel's heart hammered against his ribs as he took in the sight before him. These weren't ordinary women. They were legendary Apache warriors, the kind spoken of in hushed whispers around frontier campfires. Their muscular arms bore the scars of countless battles, and each carried weapons that had tasted blood. War clubs embedded with obsidian blades, bows carved from sacred wood, and lances decorated with eagle feathers that rustled ominously in the morning breeze. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. At the center of the circle stood their leader, a woman whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. She was taller than the rest, with silver streaks running through her black hair like lightning frozen in time. Her face bore the weathered beauty of someone who had lived through storms that would have broken lesser souls. And when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of thunder rolling across the plains. "Marcel Dubois," she said, each syllable pronounced with deliberate precision, "you have taken something that does not belong to you." Behind him, Marcel heard the soft rustle of movement as Luna, the Comanche girl he'd fallen in love with just yesterday, appeared in the doorway. Her beautiful face was pale with terror, and her dark eyes darted between the assembled warriors like a trapped deer searching for escape. The sight of her fear cut through Marcel's heart like a blade, because he knew with crushing certainty that his love for her had somehow brought this danger to both their doorsteps. The Apache leader's gaze shifted to Luna, and something cold and implacable settled over her features like winter frost. "Daughter of enemies," she said with quiet venom, "you have betrayed the sacred laws that separate our peoples. And you, white man, have stolen what our spirits have claimed as forbidden. Today, you will both learn the price of such transgression." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Marcel realized that the peaceful morning he'd awakened to might be the last he would ever see. 24 hours earlier, Marcel had been the happiest man in the New Mexico territory. He'd found Luna by the creek that ran through his property, her ankle twisted from a fall while gathering medicinal herbs. She'd been wary at first, like a wild creature unsure whether to flee or fight, but his gentle care and broken attempts at her language had gradually won her trust. By sunset, they'd been sitting by his fire, sharing stories through gestures and the few words they had in common. Luna was unlike any woman he'd ever known. Her laugh was like silver bells in the wind, and her eyes held depths of wisdom that spoke of a life lived close to the earth and its ancient rhythms. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read the language of the wilderness, and when she looked at him, Marcel felt like she could see straight through to his soul. He'd fallen in love with her courage, her kindness, and the way she made him feel like the man he'd always hoped to become. Their first kiss had happened as naturally as breathing, under a canopy of stars that seemed to shine just for them. Luna had whispered words in Comanche that he didn't understand, but felt in his bones, and he'd responded with French endearments that made her smile even though the meaning was lost. They'd made promises without words, commitments that transcended language and culture, binding themselves together with invisible threads stronger than any rope or chain. Marcel had built his small ranch on the border between Apache and Comanche territory, a decision he'd thought was simply practical. Good land was good land, regardless of the invisible lines drawn by tribal politics. He'd lived peacefully for 2 years, trading fairly with both groups and keeping to himself. No one had ever told him that falling in love with a Comanche woman would be seen as a violation of sacred Apache law, or that Luna's people and the Apache had blood feuds stretching back generations. But as Luna had fallen asleep in his arms, her head resting trustingly on his chest, Marcel had felt a nagging unease that he couldn't quite name. The night had been too quiet, the usual sounds of the prairie strangely muted, as if the very earth was holding its breath. He should have listened to that instinct, should have understood that in a land where tribal boundaries were written in blood, love could be the most dangerous thing of all. The Apache leader stepped forward, and Marcel could see the intricate tattoos that covered her arms, symbols that told the story of battles won and enemies defeated. "I am Ayana," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "War chief of the Mountain Apache, keeper of the ancient laws, and executioner of tribal justice, you have violated the Treaty of Separation, signed in blood by our ancestors and yours, Comanche girl." Her words struck Luna like physical blows, and Marcel saw her shrink back against the cabin wall. Ayana's eyes, dark as winter nights, fixed on Marcel with an intensity that made him feel like prey being measured for slaughter. For 3 generations, the Apache and Comanche have lived by the sacred separation. Our peoples do not mix, do not intermarry, do not share blood or bed. This law was written after the War of Stolen Children, when Apache raiders took Comanche young ones and Comanche warriors retaliated by burning our sacred places. The price of that conflict was too high to ever repeat. Luna found her voice, speaking in rapid Apache that Marcel couldn't understand, but recognized as desperate pleading. Ayana listened without expression, then shook her head slowly. "The law makes no exceptions for love, child. You knew this when you chose to stay with this white man instead of returning to your people. You knew that by taking him as a lover, you were spilling on the graves of our ancestors and inviting war between the tribes once again." Marcel stepped protectively in front of Luna, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, even as his heart pounded with terror. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I didn't know about any treaty. I'm not Apache or Comanche. I'm just a rancher trying to build a life. If I've broken some law, then punish me, but leave Luna out of this. She's done nothing wrong except follow her heart." Ayana's laugh was as cold as mountain wind. "Nothing wrong. She has betrayed the blood of her people and invited the curse of the spirits upon both our tribes. And you, white man, are a fool if you think ignorance absolves you of guilt. The desert is littered with the bones of men who claimed they didn't know the laws of this land. Today, you will join them unless you can prove your love is worth the war it will surely bring." Ayana raised her hand, and the circle of Apache warriors took a step closer, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun like hungry teeth. "There is only one way this ends without bloodshed," she announced, her voice carrying across the yard like a judge pronouncing sentence. "The test of fire. If this white man truly loves our enemy's daughter enough to die for her, then perhaps the spirits will show mercy. If not, then both will feed the ravens before the sun reaches its peak." Marcel felt Luna's hand slip into his, her fingers trembling but her grip fierce with determination. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice growing stronger with each word. Ayana's eyebrows rose in surprise, and several of the other warriors exchanged meaningful glances. Whatever Luna was saying, it was clearly unexpected and significant. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Luna's voice rising in passionate argument and Ayana's responses growing increasingly thoughtful. Finally, Ayana held up her hand for silence. She studied Luna's face for a long moment, then turned her penetrating gaze on Marcel. "The Comanche girl speaks with the courage of her ancestors," she said slowly. She claims that your love has awakened something in her that transcends tribal loyalty, that she would rather die beside you than live without you. She has also made a proposal that is unexpected. The pause stretched like a held breath, and Marcel felt the weight of destiny pressing down on his shoulders. She offers to undergo the trial of flames herself, Ayanna continued, to prove that her love is genuine and worthy of respect. But she insists that if she fails, you must be allowed to live and choose another path. It is a proposal that shows either great courage or great foolishness, but it is within the bounds of our ancient law. Marcel's blood turned to ice as he realized Luna was offering to sacrifice herself to save him, and every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea. No, Marcel said firmly, pulling Luna behind him. I won't let her risk her life for my ignorance. If someone has to face this trial, it should be me. I'm the one who didn't understand the law, who put her in this position. Whatever this test involves, I'll take it willingly if it means keeping her safe. The words came from the deepest part of his soul, and he meant every syllable. He'd rather die 1,000 deaths than watch Luna suffer for his mistakes. Ayanna's expression shifted subtly, and for the first time since appearing in his yard, she looked at Marcel with something that might have been respect. The trial of flames is not simply about courage, white man, she said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting ancient law. It is about proving that love can overcome the deepest hatred, that two hearts can burn brighter than the fires of vengeance that have consumed our peoples for generations. She gestured to her warriors, who began moving with practiced efficiency. Some gathered dry brush and kindling, while others drew symbols in the dust with their lance points. Within minutes, they had constructed 2 separate fire circles about 20 feet apart, each surrounded by intricate patterns that Marcel recognized as sacred symbols, even though he didn't understand their meaning. The smell of sage and sweetgrass filled the air as the women began a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to make the very ground vibrate beneath his feet. The trial is simple in concept but terrible in execution, Ayanna explained as the preparations continued around them. You and the Comanche girl will each stand in the center of a fire circle. The flames will be lit simultaneously, and you must maintain your connection, looking into each other's eyes, speaking words of love, while the fire grows around you. If your love is true and strong enough to please the spirits, you will emerge unharmed. If not, she didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Luna squeezed Marcel's hand and spoke softly in his ear, mixing English with her native tongue. She says the spirits will protect us if our love is real, she whispered, though her voice shook with fear. But Marcel, you must understand, this trial has been attempted only 3 times in Apache history. None of the previous couples survived. The fire does not forgive hesitation or doubt, and if either of us falters, we both die. Marcel looked into Luna's eyes and saw his own terror reflected there, but also a determination that took his breath away. She was willing to risk everything for their love, and he knew he could do no less. Then we don't falter, he said simply, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her fingers gently. We love each other, Luna. If that's not enough to conquer fire and hatred, then maybe it's not worth having. But I believe it is. I believe in us. Around them, the Apache warriors finished their preparations, and the moment of truth arrived like the shadow of a hawk falling across the earth. The fire circles blazed to life with a roar that seemed to shake the very sky. Marcel stepped into his circle, feeling the immediate bite of intense heat against his skin, while Luna moved gracefully into hers 20 feet away. The flames rose chest-high within seconds, creating a wall of orange and red that would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrifying. Through the dancing fire, he could see Luna's face, her dark eyes locked on his with an intensity that made everything else fade away. The heat was overwhelming, like standing inside an oven, and Marcel felt his clothes begin to smolder. Sweat poured down his face, and his lungs burned with each breath of superheated air. But Luna's voice reached him across the space between their circles, singing a Comanche love song in her native tongue. Her voice was strong and clear despite the circumstances, and it gave him the strength to stand straight and sing back to her in French, the words flowing from his heart without conscious thought. Ayanna and her warriors formed a larger circle around the fire trials, their chanting growing louder and more complex. The sound seemed to weave through the crackling flames, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made Marcel feel like he was suspended between the earthly and spirit worlds. The heat continued to intensify, and he could see that Luna was struggling too, her face flushed red and her breathing labored. But she never looked away from him, never stopped singing. The flames began to take on an eerie quality, shifting from normal orange to deep blue and purple, colors that spoke of magic and ancient power. Marcel felt something changing inside him, as if the fire was burning away everything except his love for Luna. His fear disappeared, replaced by a profound sense of connection that transcended the physical world. When he looked at Luna now, he could see her soul shining through her eyes, and he knew she was experiencing the same transformation. Time seemed to stretch and compress around them. Marcel couldn't tell if they'd been in the flames for minutes or hours, but gradually he became aware that the heat was no longer painful. The fire still raged around them, but it felt like a warm embrace rather than a deadly threat. Luna's song had evolved into something wordless and beautiful, a melody that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth itself. And in that moment, Marcel understood that they had passed beyond mere survival into something miraculous and sacred. The flames suddenly shifted, taking on forms that defied nature and logic. Marcel saw visions dancing in the fire, images of Luna's childhood among the Comanche, her first sight of him by the creek, the moment their eyes had met and both their worlds had changed forever. The fire showed him her fears and dreams, her hopes for their future together, and the terrible loneliness she'd carried before finding love in his arms. Luna gasped across the space between them, and Marcel knew she was seeing his own memories reflected in her flames. She was witnessing his arrival in New Mexico territory, broken by the horrors of war and seeking only peace and solitude. She saw his first glimpse of her by the water, the way his heart had stopped and then started beating again in an entirely new rhythm. The fire revealed his gentleness, his honor, and the depth of his commitment to protecting those he loved, but the visions went deeper, showing them truths that neither had spoken aloud. Marcel saw Luna's terror that their love was doomed, her certainty that the hatred between their peoples would eventually tear them apart. He witnessed her internal struggle between loyalty to her tribe and the overwhelming power of her feelings for him. The fire showed him her brave decision to stay with him despite knowing the danger, her willingness to face any consequence for the chance to be truly happy. Luna's face transformed as she saw Marcel's own fears, his worry that he wasn't worthy of her love, his desperate desire to give her a life better than anything she'd known, his determination to bridge the gap between their worlds through the sheer force of his devotion. The flames revealed his plans to learn her language, to understand her culture, to become the kind of man who could stand proudly beside her in any world they chose to create together. The visions culminated in a shared image that took both their breaths away, a future where their love had grown strong enough to heal old wounds, where Apache and Comanche children played together in peace, where the hatred of generations had been transformed into understanding through the example of their union. It was a glimpse of what could be if they had the courage to claim it, and in that moment, Marcel knew with absolute certainty that their love was worth any price the world might demand. The flames began to recede, pulling back like waves retreating from shore, until Marcel and Luna stood in circles of glowing embers that warmed rather than burned. Around them, the Apache warriors had fallen silent, their faces showing a mixture of awe and disbelief. Even Ayanna looked shaken, her weathered features reflecting emotions that ran too deep for words. The very air seemed charged with power, as if the spirits themselves had descended to witness what had just occurred. Luna stepped out of her circle and ran to Marcel, throwing herself into his arms with a joy that made the morning sun seem dim by comparison. Her skin was unmarked by the flames, though her clothes showed scorch marks that proved the fire had been real and dangerous. Marcel held her tightly, feeling her heart beating against his chest in perfect rhythm with his own. They had faced the ultimate test and emerged not just unharmed, but transformed. Ayanna approached them slowly, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried a reverence that hadn't been there before. "In all my years as war chief, I have never seen the spirits speak so clearly," she said, her eyes studying their faces with new understanding. "The flames have judged your love genuine and blessed it with their protection. You have proven that true devotion can overcome even the deepest hatred between peoples." She turned to address her warriors, speaking in rapid Apache that Marcel couldn't follow but recognized as significant by the reactions it provoked. Several of the women gasped, while others nodded with solemn approval. The conversation continued for several minutes, with various warriors offering input and Ayanna listening carefully before responding. Finally, she raised her hand for silence and turned back to Marcel and Luna. "The Council of Warriors has spoken," she announced formally. "Your love has been tested by fire and found worthy. The Treaty of Separation no longer applies to you. You are declared exempt from its restrictions and free to build your life together. But more than that, you have been chosen by the spirits to serve as a bridge between our peoples. If you accept this calling, you will help heal wounds that have festered for too long and bring peace where there has been only hatred." Marcel felt the weight of Ayanna's words settling on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility he'd never asked for but couldn't refuse. Luna looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears of relief and something deeper, a recognition that their love had become something larger than themselves, a force for healing in a broken world. The choice before them was clear. They could accept this sacred calling and work to bridge the gap between Apache and Comanche, or they could walk away and let the cycle of hatred continue. "What would be required of us?" Luna asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. She spoke in Apache, and Marcel was surprised to realize he could understand some of her words, as if the trial by fire had opened pathways in his mind that hadn't existed before. Ayanna smiled at Luna's question, the first genuine warmth she'd shown since appearing in their yard. "You would serve as mediators in disputes between our peoples," Ayanna explained. "Your home would become neutral ground, where Apache and Comanche could meet safely to resolve conflicts. You would teach our children to see past old hatreds and find common ground. It would not be easy. There are those on both sides who prefer war to peace, who profit from keeping our peoples divided." Marcel thought about his quiet life as a rancher, the simple dreams he'd harbored of building a modest home with Luna and living peacefully on the frontier. That life seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by a calling that could reshape the future of the entire territory. The responsibility was overwhelming, but when he looked at Luna's face, he saw the same determination that had carried her through the trial by fire. "We accept," Luna said before Marcel could speak, her voice ringing with conviction. "If our love can bring peace between Apache and Comanche, then we have a duty to try. Too many have died because of old hatreds. If we can save even one life by building understanding, then we must take this path." Marcel nodded his agreement, knowing that she had spoken for both their hearts. They had been given a gift, their love blessed by the spirits themselves, and now it was time to share that gift with the world. Ayanna stepped back and raised her hands toward the sky, beginning a chant in ancient Apache that seemed to make the very air shimmer around them. The other warriors joined in. their voices weaving together in harmonies that spoke of traditions stretching back countless generations. Marcel felt the hair on his arms rise as the power of their words washed over him, and he understood that he was witnessing something sacred and rare. Luna began singing as well, adding her Comanche voice to the Apache chorus in a musical blend that should have been impossible, but sounded perfectly natural. The two tribal songs, enemies for generations, merged into something beautiful and new, a sound that spoke of harmony where there had been only discord. Marcel found himself humming along, his French-influenced voice adding yet another layer to the supernatural symphony. The warriors began moving in a complex pattern around Marcel and Luna, their steps following rhythms older than memory. They carried sacred objects, eagle feathers, polished stones, bundles of herbs that filled the air with mystical fragrances. Each item was placed carefully around the couple, creating a circle of power that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Marcel felt energy flowing through his body, connecting him not just to Luna, but to the land itself. Ayanna produced a length of braided rope made from what looked like different colored threads, some clearly Apache in origin, others bearing the distinctive patterns of Comanche craftsmanship. This binding cord was made by the grandmothers of both tribes, she explained, her voice taking on the formal cadence of ritual. It has waited for decades for the right couple to appear. Today it fulfills its purpose. She wrapped the cord around Marcel and Luna's joined hands, speaking words in both Apache and Comanche that seemed to sink into their very souls. "By fire you have been tested," she intoned. "By the spirits you have been blessed. By the grandmother's cord you are bound. Let no force on earth separate what the sacred powers have joined. You are husband and wife, bridge builders and peacemakers, children of the earth and servants of hope." The ceremony concluded with a shout from all the warriors that echoed across the prairie like thunder, proclaiming to the world that something momentous had just occurred. 3 days after the ceremony, Marcel and Luna faced their first real challenge as bridge builders. A young Apache warrior named Tohono arrived at their door, his face grim with urgency and his horse lathered from hard riding. Behind him rode 2 Comanche men, their hands resting on their weapons and their eyes burning with barely controlled fury. The tension between the groups was so thick Marcel could almost taste it. "There has been a killing," Tohono announced without preamble. "A Comanche hunter was found dead on Apache territory, shot through the heart. These men claim he was murdered by our people, but we found him with stolen Apache horses. Both sides are calling for war, and the chiefs have sent us to you for judgment." The weight of responsibility settled on Marcel's shoulders like a physical burden, and he felt Luna tense beside him. The 2 Comanche riders dismounted, their faces hard as granite. The older of the 2, a man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles, stepped forward. "I am Nal Nish, war leader of the southern Comanche. The dead man was my nephew, a good hunter who would never steal from anyone. Someone wants war between our peoples, and they have used his death to light the fuse." His words carried the authority of command and the pain of personal loss. Luna moved forward, speaking rapidly in Comanche to Nalnish while gesturing for him to remain calm. Marcel caught enough of the conversation to understand she was explaining their new role as mediators and asking for his patience while they investigated the truth. The war leader's expression softened slightly when he realized who Luna was, but his hand remained on his weapon. Tohono shifted restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the delay. "Every hour we waste here, more warriors gather on both sides," he said urgently. "If we cannot resolve this quickly, blood will flow like rivers across the territory. Some of our young men are already painting for war, eager to settle old scores." Marcel realized they had stumbled into a powder keg that could explode at any moment, and only the truth could prevent a massacre that would consume both tribes. Marcel, Luna, and the 2 groups of warriors rode out to examine the scene where the body had been found. The location was a box canyon on disputed territory, a place where both Apache and Comanche hunting parties sometimes ventured despite the risks. The dead Comanche hunter lay exactly where he'd fallen, his body untouched out of respect for the investigation. Around him, the stolen Apache horses grazed peacefully, their presence adding to the mystery. Luna knelt beside the body, her trained eyes taking in details that others had missed. She'd learned tracking and investigation skills from her grandmother, who had served as a resolver of disputes within the Comanche tribe. "Look at his hands," she said quietly, pointing to calluses and scars that told a story. "These are not the hands of a horse thief. This man worked with leather and tools, not ropes and saddles." Marcel examined the scene from a different angle, his experience as a rancher giving him insights into horse behavior and theft patterns. "These horses aren't stolen," he announced after several minutes of careful observation. "Look at their hooves. They've been shod recently with Apache metalwork. A Comanche thief wouldn't take time to shoe stolen horses, and he certainly wouldn't use Apache smithing techniques." Tohono's eyes widened as he realized the implications. "You're saying someone wanted it to look like my people killed a Comanche thief, when actually—" He trailed off, his face darkening with understanding. Nalnish completed the thought, his voice heavy with grim realization. "Someone killed an innocent man and planted evidence to start a war between our tribes." The investigation continued as they searched for more clues. Luna found tracks that didn't belong to either Apache or Comanche, boot prints from iron-shod horses ridden by men who weren't familiar with the terrain. Marcel discovered spent cartridges from rifles that neither tribe commonly used, weapons favored by white traders and military men. Slowly, a picture emerged of a carefully planned murder designed to ignite the powder keg of tribal hatred and distract both peoples from something else entirely. As the sun reached its peak, Marcel made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in a crevice near where the body was found, he uncovered a leather pouch containing surveying tools and official-looking documents. The papers were stamped with territorial government seals and bore the signatures of men Marcel recognized as powerful politicians and business leaders. Luna read the documents carefully, her face growing pale as she translated their contents. "These are land grants," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Legal papers giving white settlers the right to claim Apache and Comanche territory for mining and railroad development. But they're only valid if both tribes are declared hostile and driven from the land." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with horrible clarity. Someone was engineering a war to justify land seizure on a massive scale. Tohono and Nalnish examined the documents with growing fury, recognizing names of government officials who had promised peace while secretly planning betrayal. "Governor Hernandez," Nalnish spat, recognizing one signature. "He came to our camp last month, speaking of friendship and mutual cooperation, all while planning to steal our sacred lands." The war leader's hand moved to his tomahawk, and Marcel could see murder in his eyes. The surveying tools told the rest of the story. Someone had been mapping tribal territories, identifying the most valuable mineral deposits and water sources, preparing for a land grab that would dwarf anything seen before in the territory. The murder had been just the opening move in a larger game, designed to trigger a war that would give the government excuse to relocate or eliminate both tribes entirely. Marcel felt sick as he realized the scope of the conspiracy. Innocent people on both sides were being manipulated into killing each other, while white politicians and businessmen prepared to profit from their deaths. "We have to stop this," he said firmly. "Both your peoples are being played against each other by men who see you as nothing more than obstacles to their greed. The real enemy isn't Apache or Comanche. It's the corruption that's trying to destroy you both." Word came at sunset that war parties from both tribes were already moving toward the traditional battleground at Red Rock Mesa, their warriors painted and armed for a conflict that could end with hundreds dead. Marcel, Luna, and their small group of witnesses raced through the night, pushing their horses to the breaking point in a desperate attempt to reach the war chiefs before blood was spilled. The evidence they carried could prevent a massacre, but only if they arrived in time. Luna rode like the wind itself, her Comanche training allowing her to navigate the treacherous night terrain with supernatural skill. Beside her, Tohono matched her pace, his Apache knowledge of the land providing shortcuts that could save precious minutes. Marcel pushed his horse harder than ever before, knowing that every second of delay brought them closer to tragedy. The moon was their only light, casting eerie shadows across the landscape as they flew across the prairie. They reached Red Rock Mesa, just as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky. Below them in the valley, two armies faced each other across a field that had seen too much bloodshed over the generations. Apache warriors on one side, Comanche on the other, both groups bristling with weapons and barely restrained fury. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, and Marcel knew that one wrong move would trigger a battle that could consume both tribes. The war chiefs stood between the armies, engaged in the formal dialogue that preceded combat. Marcel could see the ritual nature of their conversation, the ancient protocols that governed warfare between the tribes. But he could also see the genuine anger and grief that drove both leaders, the accumulated pain of generations of conflict finally reaching a breaking point. Time was running out, and soon words would give way to arrows and bullets. Luna spurred her horse down the slope toward the gathering, calling out in both languages for the chiefs to wait. Her voice carried across the valley like a bell, and gradually both armies turned to see the small group racing toward them with desperate urgency. Marcel prayed they would be granted the chance to speak before someone decided they were enemies trying to disrupt the sacred ritual of war. Both war chiefs agreed to hear their evidence, though Marcel could see skepticism and impatience in their weathered faces. The Apache chief, a man called Stone Bear, listened with growing amazement as Tohono described the scene at the canyon and the evidence they'd uncovered. On the Comanche side, War Chief Eagle Feather's expression shifted from anger to shocked disbelief as Nalnish presented the surveying documents and explained their implications. Luna stood between the two armies and spoke with a voice that carried across the entire valley. She told the story of the murdered hunter, the planted evidence, and the conspiracy designed to turn Apache and Comanche into tools for white men's greed. Her words were simple but powerful, cutting through generations of mistrust with the sharp blade of truth. Marcel watched faces change as understanding dawned. Anger slowly shifting from tribal enemies to the real architects of their suffering. The documents passed from hand to hand, with elders from both tribes examining the official seals and recognizing the signatures of men they'd trusted. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Both peoples had been manipulated into preparing for a war that would serve only their enemies' interests. The silence that followed Luna's revelation was more profound than any battle cry, filled with the weight of betrayal and the pain of recognition. Stone Bear rose to his full, impressive height and addressed both armies in a voice that carried the authority of absolute leadership. For too long, we have spilled each other's blood while our real enemies watched from safety, he declared. Today we choose a different path. Today Apache and Comanche stand together against those who would see us both destroyed. His words sent ripples of shock through both armies, but Marcel could see acceptance beginning to dawn on many faces. Eagle Feather stepped forward and extended his hand to Stone Bear in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just hours before. "My brother speaks truth," he said formally. "Our ancestors would weep to see us fight each other while strangers steal the land of our fathers. Let this day mark the beginning of understanding, not the end of hope." The handshake between the two war chiefs sent a murmur through both armies that sounded like the first whisper of a new age. The transformation that followed was nothing short of miraculous. Within hours, the two armies that had been prepared to slaughter each other were working together to plan a response to the real threat. War councils that had been separated for generations met in the shadow of Red Rock Mesa, with Apache and Comanche leaders sharing information and resources in ways that would have seemed impossible at sunrise. Luna and Marcel found themselves at the center of the planning, their unique position as bridge builders making them natural coordinators between the tribes. Marcel's experience with territorial politics provided insights into how the conspiracy might be structured, while Luna's knowledge of both cultures helped translate not just languages but entire ways of thinking. They were creating something entirely new, an alliance between peoples who had been enemies since before living memory. The evidence they'd discovered was just the beginning. As more information was shared between the tribes, a fuller picture emerged of the scope of the conspiracy against them. Government officials, mining companies, railroad barons, and corrupt military officers had all played roles in the plan to eliminate tribal resistance to Western expansion. The murdered hunter was just one casualty in a war that had been going on in shadows for years. But now, that war was about to become visible. Stone Bear and Eagle Feather began planning a joint response that would expose the conspiracy and bring the guilty parties to justice. It would require careful coordination, ironclad evidence, and the kind of courage that had made both tribes legendary. The alliance was fragile and new, but it was also powerful in ways that none of the conspirators had anticipated. Marcel felt a mixture of pride and terror as he watched the plans take shape. Their love had indeed become a bridge between peoples, but now that bridge was about to be tested by forces that would stop at nothing to destroy it. The next few days would determine whether the alliance could survive its first real challenge and whether the peace they'd helped create could withstand the storm that was surely coming. Governor Hernandez arrived at his private ranch 3 days later, expecting to find reports of a successful Apache-Comanche war that would justify his planned land seizures. Instead, he found himself surrounded by a joint force of warriors from both tribes, their weapons trained on him and his corrupt associates with deadly precision. The conspiracy he'd thought was unraveling exactly as planned had instead been exposed and turned against him. Marcel stood with Luna and the war chiefs as the governor was forced to confront the evidence of his crimes. The surveying documents, the forged reports claiming tribal hostilities, the orders for illegal land grants, it was all laid out before him like pieces of a puzzle that formed a picture of corruption and betrayal. Hernandez's face went pale as he realized his carefully constructed plans had collapsed completely. "You have orchestrated the deaths of innocent people for profit," Stone Bear said with quiet fury. "You have betrayed the trust of those who believed your promises of peace. Apache law demands blood payment for such crimes." His words carried the weight of absolute judgment, and Marcel could see genuine fear creeping into the governor's eyes as he understood the gravity of his situation. Eagle Feather stepped forward, his voice equally cold and implacable. "Comanche justice agrees with our Apache brothers, but we are merciful people. You will have one chance to make amends for your crimes: full confession, return of all stolen lands, and public exposure of every person involved in this conspiracy. Refuse, and you will face the traditional punishment for those who wage war through deception." The governor's associates, mining executives, corrupt military officers, and crooked territorial officials shifted nervously as they realized their fates hung in the balance. Some began talking immediately, eager to save their own skins by revealing the full scope of the conspiracy. Others remained defiant until they saw the determination in the warriors' faces and understood that this was not a negotiation they could win through bluster or bribery. The confessions that followed revealed a conspiracy that reached all the way to Washington, involving senators, military generals, and business leaders who had been systematically stealing tribal lands across the entire western frontier. Marcel felt sick as the scope of the betrayal became clear. This wasn't just about one territory or two tribes, but about a coordinated effort to eliminate native resistance to white expansion through manufactured conflicts. Luna worked tirelessly to document every confession, her education allowing her to create detailed records that could be used as evidence in territorial and federal courts. The Apache and Comanche leaders proved surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of white legal systems, having learned through bitter experience how to fight corruption with its own tools. Together, they assembled a case that would expose the conspiracy to national attention. But justice took many forms. Some of the conspirators faced tribal justice, immediate and harsh punishment for crimes against the people. Others were turned over to federal authorities who had not been compromised by the conspiracy, facing trials that would send shockwaves through territorial politics. A few, like Governor Hernandez, were given the chance to redeem themselves through full cooperation and the return of stolen wealth. The most satisfying moments came when the stolen land grants were publicly burned and the illegal claims were officially revoked. Marcel watched with tears in his eyes as Apache and Comanche families returned to sacred sites they'd thought lost forever. Their joy and relief a testament to the power of truth over deception. The alliance between the tribes had not only prevented a war, it had reclaimed justice from the jaws of corruption. As the immediate crisis passed, Marcel and Luna found themselves facing a new challenge, helping to build something permanent from the temporary alliance that had saved both tribes. The war chiefs had decided that the cooperation born from necessity should be nurtured into lasting friendship, but that would require bridge builders who could help both peoples learn to see past centuries of mistrust and hatred. 6 months after the conspiracy's exposure, Marcel and Luna's ranch had become something unique in the American West, a place where Apache and Comanche families came together to trade, learn, and slowly build the foundation of lasting peace. Children from both tribes played together in the yard, their laughter proving that hatred was learned, not inherited. Their parents watched with amazement as barriers that had seemed impossible to cross crumbled under the simple power of human connection. Luna had established a school where young people from both tribes learned to read and write in English, Apache, and Comanche, creating a generation that could communicate across all the boundaries that had divided their peoples. Marcel taught practical skills like ranching and farming, while Apache and Comanche elders shared traditional knowledge about medicine, astronomy, and the sacred relationship between people and land. The exchange of knowledge was creating something entirely new in the territory. The success hadn't come without challenges. There were still those on all sides who preferred the old hatreds to the new cooperation, and several attempts had been made to disrupt the peace process through violence and sabotage. But each attack had only served to strengthen the alliance, as Apache and Comanche warriors stood together to defend the bridge builders and the hope they represented. Marcel often stood in his doorway at sunset, watching Luna work with the children and marveling at how far they'd all come from that terrifying morning when 10 Apache warriors had surrounded his house. Their love had indeed become something larger than themselves, a force for healing that was transforming an entire region. The ranch was no longer just a home. It was a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred. But the greatest transformation had been in Marcel and Luna themselves. Their love, tested by fire and strengthened by adversity, had grown into something deeper and more profound than either had imagined possible. They had learned that true love wasn't just about two hearts finding each other. It was about those hearts working together to make the world a better place for everyone. 2 years later, Marcel stood before a gathering that would have been impossible to imagine when he first arrived in New Mexico territory. Apache and Comanche leaders sat side by side in the great hall he and Luna had built on their expanded ranch, joined by territorial officials, federal representatives, and business leaders who had come to witness the signing of the Treaty of Red Rock Mesa, a formal peace agreement between the tribes and the territorial government. Luna, now visibly pregnant with their first child, moved gracefully through the crowd, translating and mediating as the final details of the treaty were negotiated. The agreement guaranteed tribal sovereignty over sacred lands, established fair trading relationships, and created a permanent council with representatives from both tribes to resolve future disputes peacefully. It was everything they had worked toward, formalized in law and witnessed by the world. Stone Bear and Eagle Feather stood together to sign the treaty, their friendship now as legendary as their former enmity had been. "Today we write a new story for our peoples," Stone Bear declared as he put his mark on the document. "A story that our children and their children will read with pride, knowing that we chose wisdom over war, understanding over hatred." The ceremony concluded with a celebration that lasted 3 days, featuring traditional foods, music, and dances from both tribes, alongside frontier festivities that brought together all the territory's diverse peoples. Marcel watched with wonder as Apache and Comanche warriors competed in friendly contests, as children from a dozen different backgrounds played together without thought of racial divisions, as the future took shape before his eyes. As the sun set on the final day of celebration, Marcel and Luna stood together on their porch, her hand resting on the life growing within her. "Do you think our child will understand what their parents helped accomplish here?" Luna asked softly, her voice filled with the contentment of dreams fulfilled. Marcel kissed her forehead and pulled her close, looking out over the land where love had conquered hatred, where understanding had defeated fear, where two hearts had become the foundation for a better world. "They'll understand," he said with quiet certainty, "because we'll make sure they do. And maybe, if we're very lucky, they'll build something even better than what we've started here." In the distance, the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, shining down on a land where love had indeed proven stronger than any force that sought to divide the human heart.